Hello, welcome to week 2. Today we'll be talking about how trauma impacts the body. You'll recall from last week that post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, as a diagnosis involves the following things: exposure to a traumatic event, intrusive symptoms, intrusion, which is thinking about the trauma when you don't want to, avoidance symptoms, which is making efforts to avoid thinking about or reminders of the trauma, cognitive and mood changes, which include thinking about yourself differently, thinking about your world differently, thinking about your life expectancy differently, and also changes in mood like the ability to feel pleasure. And then we also have arousal and reactivity symptoms, symptoms where your body is responding strongly to stimuli like hyper arousal, jumpiness, and easily startled. So these are all the parameters of PTSD, and we'll use this as a jumping off point to talk about what trauma is doing to the body. Why are these things happening? So I like to say that our bodies sound alarms when trauma happens. And God has created our bodies in such a way that they are oriented to keep us safe. They do things automatically without us having to think about them. They do things automatically in an effort to keep us safe. All of those reactions that our body does without us having to think about them, those unconscious reactions, have a purpose, and those purposes are to keep us safe. But in trauma, in traumatic stress, these adaptive responses, these responses that are adaptive in the middle of trauma, become maladaptive, or they don't make sense anymore when they don't match the situation. So if we maintain our trauma response outside the context of the trauma, you could see how that could cause some difficulties. And let's get more specific. So the body at rest is engaging the parasympathetic nervous system. And you'll recall some of this from your reading, that this branch of the central nervous system is responsible for things that our body does while it's at rest: eating, bowel and functions like that, slow breathing, rest. See, people can sometimes call the parasympathetic nervous system the rest and digest system compared with the fight or flight of the sympathetic nervous system. So while we're in this area, things are pretty chill. Slow heartbeat, our stomachs are working, everything is calm, our bladder is able to be in control. We can have control of it. We can decide what happens when. In this place, when the body is at rest, we are activating the parasympathetic nervous system. Things that need a calm body to be done, like sleeping, basic body functions, all of those things are done and are in charge of by the parasympathetic nervous system. And you can see this woman here. She's sipping a drink. She's sitting there. She has perceived no threats. And so her body does not need to be in preparation to do anything. She can just be in this moment. When we contrast that with the body in distress or in the presence of a perceived threat, this threat here is a bear. If a bear came and just ran into this room right now, none of us, well, you're not in the same room as I am, but I wouldn't have to think about it. I wouldn't have to think, there's a bear. Maybe I'm afraid of bears. It would be a very quick, automatic process. Bear, threat, danger. My body responds even without me telling my body, okay, legs, it's time to run. Okay, heart, it's time to beat faster. The body just responds. And the part of the central nervous system that's in charge of that is called the sympathetic nervous system. I remember this by saying that my nervous system is sympathetic to the plight that I'm in. That's how I remembered it in grad school. So this part of our body does things that prepare us to take action. And before we used to say fight or flight, I'm going to update that for you in a few slides, but it prepares us to take action in some way that alleviates the threat, that gets rid of the threat, or that could keep us safe in the presence of the threat. Pupils dilating, inhibit salivation, our tummy. We don't care about food right now. That's not important. We need to be able to move. So blood goes pumping, adrenaline goes pumping through our bodies, our heart beats faster. We get different hormone secretions that happen that all allow us to get ready to act. So here's another image. Stress on one side with the sympathetic nervous system, pupils expanding, fast, shallow breaths, heart is pumping faster, gut inactive. Compared and contrasted with parasympathetic, where the pupils shrink, they dilate, slow, deep breaths, heart slows down, the gut can be active now. So in this instance, we see the stressor. We're going from left to right. We see the stressor. We perceive that that thing is threatening, and then our body has a physiological response to the perception of the stressor. So we perceive it as threatening. That's a very important part, that we perceive this as threatening, but that exposure to stressor and perception is usually a very short thing. But this could also explain why some people who have trauma have an overactive perceiver and they might perceive threat where there is none. But we'll get there again later. So what happens is that in the absence of a stressor, we're still perceiving stress and having a stress response. And that's that sympathetic nervous system getting ready for us to respond to a threat. And so we can understand why people would have a hard time operating in the world if their perceiver is overactive. If their alarm is going off in the absence of a threat, or their alarm is going off all the time, then that can have an impact on how they interact with other people, how they begin to trust themselves and their own perceptions, how their body responds. If the body can never have a chance to be at rest, then the body can never do those things that need to happen with the parasympathetic nervous system, like digestion, like sleep, like renewal, like consolidation and memory. All those things happen during the when the parasympathetic nervous system is active. And so if it's not active, if the sympathetic nervous system is always active, then they're not able to do all of what God created their body to do. So the stress response to trauma, you've probably heard fight or flight before. In the presence of a threat, there is fight or flight. Your body gets ready to either fight the bear or run away from the bear. That is absolutely accurate. But as research has begun to develop, they also identify freeze. Okay, so maybe you fight the bear or you run away from the bear, or you might freeze. Perhaps you freeze in order to hide, and we think about how this could help us just over time and humans across centuries, right? You can freeze to hide, or you could freeze in response to somebody who is too big for you to fight or run away from. And so that might look like dissociation, which means you separate from reality, you cut yourself off from reality. And they talked about this in the Body Keep Score book as well, how that freeze response is an innate thing that our body can do in order to keep us safe. We separate from this situation that is completely overwhelming. But there are three other ones that I want to introduce you to that you may not have heard of. There's another one called fawn. And fawn is a response that is typically seen in early childhood trauma. This is something that a child might do that would keep them safe. They can't really fight, they probably can't run away, freeze might not work for them. And so fawn is a way for them to kind of engender themselves to the aggressor. I'm going to anticipate your needs, be overly friendly, overly pleasing to avoid the threat in the first place. You, as a perpetrator, are so threatening that I must avoid getting into that situation because I know I can't run away or fight or freeze. And so I'm going to become the most overly compliant, overly people pleasing, overly kind of affectionate person, trying to anticipate your needs, trying to avoid an explosion of your threat. And so that could be a fawn response. And then there's tend and befriend. So a psychologist, Shelley, what's her last name? Her article's attached here. Her first name is Shelley. She said, fight or flight, that makes sense, but it seems kind of like a male response. What about, like, is the female response different in terms of stress? Because it doesn't seem to match what we're seeing in women who have trauma responses. And so her research showed that while it made sense for the man to fight or run away, if the women fought and ran away, maybe in caveman days, they would leave babies behind if they ran away. Or if they're trying to run away, they wouldn't be very successful at running because they're carrying a baby. And so she noticed when they did research that women tend to have more of a tend or befriend response. Tend means they're tending in the presence of a threat, they are turning from the threat and tending to the babies, making sure that the next generation lives on. Or they befriend, they find another set of cohorts that will help them kind of bond together to survive the trauma together. I think of it as forming like a sister circle so that we can survive together. I'm going to go find some other women and we're going to hunker down. And so this female response might be different. So I say the different responses because people don't respond to trauma in the same way. When that sympathetic nervous system gets activated, it doesn't look on our bodies the same as it looks to other people, on other people. So we might have a fight response, we might have a flight response, we might have a freeze response, we might have a fawn response, we might have a tend response, we might have a befriend response. And all of those responses are adaptive in a way to keep us safe. You might find a lot of people come to you with shame over how they responded. They have identified their way of responding during the trauma as a bad way to respond. And I see this a lot with the freeze, where people think, why didn't I fight back? Why didn't I run? And it can be incredibly healing for you to explain to people that that's one of the ways that your body kept you safe. That's one of the ways that God uniquely created you so that you could survive that moment. And so freeze might not be working for you anymore, but in that moment, it kept you alive. And that can, I've had so many clients experience just freedom from hearing, wow, I'm not crazy or weak or a sissy for having the response that I did in the middle of the trauma. And so trauma changes us. Trauma changes us in the moment that it happens. It has an immediate change on our body chemistry and prepares us to do something about it. And I love the way that it's described as speechless horror. When they looked at our brain scans and they saw that in Broca's area, and which is responsible for speech, and then also the visual occipital area, there's a response in our brain where we're experiencing trauma and we can't quite put words to it, which is why I love using art with trauma, because sometimes art is able to articulate the inarticulable, because it's hard to explain something that is so overwhelming to the system. And trauma also changes how we perceive our environment, how we interpret cues, how we understand the world, how we understand what it means to be safe. It also changes how we respond to the world. We might continue our trauma response, like we said, in the absence of a stressor. And so that changes how we respond in relationships, and that changes how people respond to us as well. And we're going to talk about this in the next slide. It changes our brains and our genetic expression. It changes the wiring in our brains. And so the concept of neuroplasticity is that our brains can be changed by what happens out here. So it's not just we're born, our brain is what it is, and we're done. The things that happen to us make connections, make wires, and the things that fire together wire together, right? And so if man and threat are firing together, a person has been exposed to several men that hurt them over time, the wire between man and threat, the little line between them in our brain, the neural pathway, is a very worn pathway. And so it gets difficult to disengage man from threat. And so you might feel unsafe in the presence of a man who is objectively safe, you might see him as unsafe because in your brain, the connection between man and unsafe has been wired and rewired and reinforced by your own experiences. It can also change us at a genetic level. When you watch the video this week about the Holocaust survivors, you'll see that it impacted their genetic coding and genetic codings that come after them. So not only does it impact our genetic level, but it impacts those in the generations to come. When trauma impacts our brains, it also impacts how we begin to take in information, how we learn. When I worked with young children who were traumatized, one of the most frequent questions we would get is, does this child have ADHD or PTSD? And it was a very difficult question to answer because ADHD and PTSD, especially in children, look very similar. And PTSD could look like ADHD, if that makes sense, but it's actually trauma. The trauma has interrupted that child's ability to learn because to learn, you need to be able to be in that parasympathetic nervous system. You can't be in the fight or flight or freeze, fawn, tend, or befriend mode. You can't learn in that way. That's not a time for you to learn. That's a time for you to get to safety. And so if you're living in that stage, it's hard for you to switch your brain over to a place where you can take in and synthesize information. So it can change how we learn, how we grow, and then also how we connect. It's hard to connect with somebody in the absence of safety, and it's hard to connect with somebody when there's a perceived threat. Yeah. It also changes our body chemistry to the point where it can change our physical health. And this I find to be very, very interesting because this is what the ACEs study is all about. When we're having our body respond with the sympathetic nervous system, we have this flood of hormones. And what the body is supposed to do is you go up and then you come back down. But some people's bodies go up and then stay up. Or some people's bodies go up, and while they're coming back down, another threat happens and sends them back up. And then while they're coming back down, another threat happens and sends them back up. And so they never get back to baseline. They never get back to the place where their body can relax. And so that means that the body's organs and all of our systems are being flooded with stress hormones constantly. Stress hormones are supposed to be a temporary response to get us out of danger. But if we're being flooded with them constantly, that disrupts the system to the point where there can be physiological ramifications. So, chronic illness, and this is very interesting to me. As someone with a chronic illness, I have lupus, and as a young child, I was exposed to a traumatic event. And this is fairly new research that they're showing that early exposure to trauma that develops into a nervous system issue can become chronic illness. And so this is from something from an autonomic nervous system society, but I love this image. But they are conceptualizing chronic illness as a nervous system issue. So we can't inhibit the fight or flight disconnection, or we can't inhibit the fight or flight response. And so we have to disconnect from our bodies. That could be that dissociative piece. And we learn to mistrust our own perceptions of that which is dangerous and that which is not. And so we develop an inaccurate perception of what is stressful. And so we're not able to engage in play or joy safely. We can't calm ourselves because we can't tell, am I really dysregulated? Am I really upset? Am I really in danger? What's going on? I don't even know how to feel. All I know is that my body feels like the alarm's going off and I have no idea why. So this has impacts, especially on the things that have to do with your circulatory system, like blood pressure, heart rate, blood sugar, insulin, breathing, energy, digestion, memory. All of those things you will remember in the parasympathetic nervous system. Those things can be activated and regulated. We can digest, we can go through those processes a little bit better. But when they're being flooded with these hormones, and when our nervous system is no longer operating in alignment with how it was supposed to operate, then we can have these physiological symptoms that persist. And it's not like a somatic kind of experience of like, my arm hurts, but I'm really depressed. No, this is an actual changes in actual blood pressure and actual heart rate. It impacts the actual physical symptom, the actual physical structure of the body. So, trauma can be transmitted through us um, and impact us on a cellular level, and then continue to be transmitted beyond ourselves. This image to me is very, very interesting. I remember when I was pregnant with my daughter, and I read something about how when when a female child is born, all the ovaries all the eggs that she'll ever have are already present. That is amazing to me, like really, really cool. So a man's sperm gets created later in life. It begins to get created during puberty, but the eggs for a female are already there, all of them. She does not grow any new eggs. What you got is what you got. So that means that part of my grandchild was in my body already when I was pregnant with her. And so this image says, before your mother was born, your mother, grandmother, and the earliest trace of you were all in the same body. Wow. So that means that whatever happened to my maternal grandmother's name is Alnetta. Whatever happened to her happened to my mom when she was pregnant with my mom, and me, the egg that was in my mom. It happened to all three of us. And so that can kind of give you some um, idea of the epigenetics, the way that information is transmitted through genes across generations. And then there's also how it's transmitted in other ways, in environment as well. So let's look at this image. We're looking at the baby in the mom. The mother releases cortisol. So if this is a mom experiencing something traumatic, her body goes through the sympathetic nervous response. She has this release of hormones. That release of hormones gets absorbed through the placenta to the baby. And this can impact the baby's development of their brain. We know that reptilian brain gets developed very, very early on. That's one of the first things that develop. And that regulates how a baby does those basic bodily functions: eating, sleeping, pooping, peeing, all the things that you need to do to survive. That's the first part of the brain that develops. And so it makes sense that when something happens to the mom, or even when she ingests something or goes through a traumatic event, when there's any kind of trauma that happens to the mom, it also happens to the baby and can impact the baby's brain. Quick pause here to give you a little bit of hope. Neuroplasticity means that these things can change, though, that there are a lot of things that can be rewired. I have to remind myself of that when I'm talking about this information, because it can seem so fatalistic and terrifying. But the amazing thing is that our brains can be rewired. So, in addition to this physical thing that's happening, through the transmission of what happened to mom impacting baby genetically, chemically, physically, it also might change how that caregiver interacts with her world. That might change how she is as a mother. So the caregiver might struggle to regulate. She might have PTSD herself, and a mom with PTSD or depression might have issues with attaching to a baby. She might be hyperprotective, or she might be disconnected. She might be completely crying in her bed and unable to soothe herself, and therefore unable to soothe her child. There might be several ramifications that change her environment, as well as change how her body reacted to the stress. So this can impact the child on a different level, but still in that same traumatic vein. It can impact how they develop. It can impact how they see the world. It can impact their sense of safety. It can make their experience of childhood traumatic, which might then get also passed on through the genes. And so in adulthood, a person who had a caregiver with untreated trauma might be more prone to PSD, might struggle to repair after conflict, might struggle with relationships, might bring unintentionally negative behaviors out in each other, might be emotionally detached, might be more prone to dissociation. And so, to break the cycle of trauma, we can bring healing in at any point. And when we start to treat the trauma, we can treat it at a genetic level as well. When you watch the video about the Holocaust, think about how at the end the woman talks about how the change in gene might also account for the lessons that she learned from being the child of a resilient survivor. So these changes might not always be for the worse. And so epigenetics, to give you another definition, this is about how your environment can impact how your genes are expressed. So genes are not set in stone. They can be impacted by our environment, and that can impact how we learn, grow, and develop. Okay, so in addition to the environment in the home, the body, the impact of trauma on the body, the impact of trauma on the home system, we can also have the cultural transmission of trauma. And so for the other part of your lecture, I'd like for you to watch the 2 videos on the page that you'll find in week 2. The first is post-traumatic slave syndrome. And this talks about a particular kind of cultural transmission. And then the other one is this Holocaust survivor research that talks about another particular kind of cultural transmission. And I would like to hear your thoughts about some of these things and how they might relate to things that you see in your own culture or upbringing or in your own communities, and bring that into the conversation this week in the forums. So that is all that I have for today. Next week, we will talk about the layers of trauma here. So we talked a little bit about genes and the changes in the genes, and a little bit about the system, and then we'll go on later to talk about the other layers so that we can see how it's usually not one isolated incident, but it's the context in which that incident happens, and it's the context in which that individual continues to live after the incident or incidents have completed. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions or thoughts. You're doing great so far, and I will talk to you soon.